Welcome to Daunt Books. Welcome to a very special event here to celebrate the publication of Box 88, Charles Cumming's latest, no doubt, bestseller. We're delighted to welcome Charles and Boris Starling here this evening to record a special chat about the book. Charles Cumming has clearly become one of the great spy writers of our time, one of the great modern masters of the genre. And he's pulled it off again with Box 88. A lot of people were saying, what do you do with spy writing after the sort of Cold War sort of era is over? This is the book, this is the answer, this is very much the link, a book which spans the end of the Cold War right up to the present day, flips back and forth between the two, hinges on Lockerbie. It's a super book, and already, as you can see from his contemporaries like Mick Herron, a wonderful spy novel, his most ambitious and best yet, and we're delighted that he's here really to launch this book this evening. He's been signing copies, and he's also very happy to dedicate copies if you'd like to buy them online. Dedicated ones will be available up to the 15th of October, and Charles will pop in and just finish off those dedications, and they'll go out shortly thereafter. So do go online to Daunt Books to get your signed dedicated copies. We're very grateful to Boris Starling for coming in, fellow author, fellow spy writer, to come in and talk to Charles this evening. They're both good friends. I'm going to get out of shot and leave you both. Thank you, Boris and Charles.
Thank you so much.
Hello, good evening and welcome, as David Frost once said, in fact, more than once said. Charles, the obvious place to start is at the beginning. Tell us a little bit about Box 88 and what it's about.
So, Box 88 came about because I felt that the 21st century spy thriller was sort of saturated in book form and on the television. When I first started, when you and I were young writers, I think there was John le Carre, there was Henry Porter, and there was me, and there was no Google, and there was no Facebook, and spy novels could be written in an old-fashioned tradecraft, so to speak. And I wanted to go back to that, find a way of going back to that. So I hit upon the idea of a young spy, Lachlan Kite, who's recruited out of an elite boarding school in the late 1980s, and following his career through the 1990s up to, so to speak, Google, up to 9/11, and then perhaps beyond, and then oscillating with a contemporary storyline. And so you sort of have the best of both worlds, so to speak, and that allows me to track Kite's development as a man, as a intelligence officer, through 3 decades of his young adult life into middle age, so to speak. So that's really where it came from. And Box 88 is a fictional American-British intelligence outfit, which sort of does the jobs that SIS, MI6, and CIA are either not sort of permitted to do or don't have the bandwidth to do. So typically, MI6 will receive what they call requirements from Downing Street. Mr. Johnson will say, I need information on this, I need information on that, and MI6 will provide it to the government. But Box 88 goes sort of above and beyond. They don't have oversight. They have a lot of money from America, and they make more waves than MI6 would traditionally make. So Kite comes in at the very beginning of Box 88's existence and gets higher and higher within the sort of hierarchy.
And the twin timelines work really well. And what struck me about them is not just they don't just work well in terms of plot, but also, as you say, in character. And you and I are now of a certain age that you remember what it was like to be young, to be 18, and then you see that life in middle age has not panned out in the way you thought it would. I mean, some things have been better, some things have been worse. But it's sort of, in that respect, it's almost treading similar ground, someone like David Nichols, to the way he writes about, middle age and the way that no one gets to our age unscathed. But we know an awful lot more now than we did then. Which shows you how little we knew then, because we don't know that much now.
Well, it was always interesting to me to write genre novels, spy fiction, that was not purely blowing things up or following people around. Or
I like those bits though.
People enjoy that, and they're fun to write. But relationships were always very important to me. Character was always very important to me, and character development. So yes, the Kite is allowing for that, and I'm in the middle of doing coming towards the end of writing a sequel to Box 88 at the moment, and he's 3 years older than he is in Box. He is at university, and he's called away for another operation by his boss, Michael Strawson. And then you see him in the present day, and he's, touching what you were saying, he's about 6 weeks away from his 50th birthday and starting to feel, the age catching up with him, and he's kind of lost his edge and what used to drive and propel him. And he is almost sort of trying to make a decision about whether just to sort of stop and do something else, or to get right back in and become operational again.
Is he and this is not supposed to be flippant, is he having a midlife crisis?
Well, it's a sort of, I suppose it is, yeah. I mean, he's recovering from what happens in Box 88, and the story continues quite soon after that, and it takes place in this very strange, destabilizing year that we're having now. I was sometimes books can date very quickly if you make direct sort of reference to something that's happened, but I think the COVID thing is going to be with us for some time yet. Strangeness of social distancing, and we were all wearing masks until about 45 seconds ago, and that has had an effect on intelligence work and spying as it has on bookselling and restaurants.
Because the COVID thing is interesting because I know you've been writing about it. How much that has changed the espionage thing, because obviously most of human intelligence revolves around face-to-face contact, either overtly or covertly in terms of dead drops, brush contacts, and so on. And you can't, you can do a brush contact in a busy crowd. You can't do it in Leicester Square where you're the only two people there. It's slightly obvious. Yeah. No,
it's a very strange moment for not just MI5 and MI6, but for every intelligence service around the world. The business of intelligence is the gathering of information, and how do you gather information? You get it from another human being, unless you're bugging their laptop or their phone and so forth. But in traditional classic espionage, you must meet an agent and find out what it is that they want to tell you. But you can't meet an agent in the moment without drawing an enormous amount of attention to yourself. For 3 or 4 months worldwide, you simply couldn't move. If now if I'm now an SIS officer and I want to go see somebody that I recruited a couple of years ago, now we're speaking in the middle of September. I could do it, but we'd have to wear a mask. What if I infected him or her, or they infected me? Would we have to sort of then get on the phone and go, by the way, I'm really sorry, but I've tested positive? And all these crazy things. It's affected intelligence gathering in a classic sense.
There was of course something to stop MI6 taking over Ocado and using their agents to go in under the cover of.
No, I'm sure that they've done that. I'm sure that if you wanted to have plausible cover in London in April and May, and you needed to keep an eye on somebody, then the way to do that would be with an Ocado lorry or Ocado for sure.
Well, with a few substitute items saying we haven't got the avocados. Here's a secret document.
No, because you needed a plausible, or if you were in France, it's impossible to leave your house in France. If you work for the DGSE, you immediately get a dog, so you have an excuse to go out to the park and meet somebody. But even meeting someone in the park, you're going to be spotted. Surveillance is impossible under lockdown.
Yes,
because you stand out, as you say, like a sore thumb.
And human is still very important. I know, because I've been working on a book with a guy who used to be in the SAS, and we have a whole chapter on intelligence, and all the stuff they're doing, with SIGINT and other technological stuff and so on, and electronic footprints and material fingerprints. There's nothing beats talking to a human.
Yeah, and this has been a great shift in the last 20 years since I started writing spy novels. This is the period I was referencing before, with sort of just me and Henry and the sort of post-Cold War Le Carré. In those days, you did have to.
This was sort of Francis Fukuyama's end of history era.
Exactly. Yeah.
He's been quiet lately, hasn't he?
But spying has completely changed in the last 20 years. The mobile phone has radically shifted the way in which intelligence is gathered. You can listen to people, you can track them, you can follow them around, you can blow them up with a mobile phone. If you're an intelligence officer trying to travel under alias to a foreign country, you have the problem of biometric passports, you have the problem of retinal scans at airports, you have number plate recognition cameras on the motorway. It's now become impossible to behave as an intelligence officer would have behaved 20 years ago, 50 years ago. which comes back to Box 88 and looking at the way in which the trade crafts have changed
But that's surely
in
also
our lifetime.
That's also surely the nature of espionage. Is like anything, like it's always changing. You know, spies need to be adaptable, and that even what was true during the Cold War was not necessarily true during the First World War. You know, that you look at something like the Riddle of the Sands, and it feels very dated even from the 80s, let alone now.
Yeah.
And you realise that you could say the same thing going back to Napoleonic times, to the Great Game, to let alone ancient times.
Yeah, I think the difference is the individual. That somebody could always pass themselves off as Paul or Dan or Chris with a false passport. Now, it's really impossible for you, Boris Starling, to pretend to be somebody else for any meaningful length of time.
Yeah.
You could do it once. You could go to Dubai on one operation and then you're gone, basically. So what the intelligence services are doing now is identifying people either straight out of university or young people or people who want to change in career in midlife, an accountant or a chef, and putting their NOCs, basically non-official cover in the sort of old-fashioned sense. So somebody who will continue to be Boris Starling through his life, but will be working for HMG on the side, instead of taking on different personalities. Because as soon as you try and assume a different identity, it falls apart in the age of Facebook and Twitter and online banking records and online telephone and so forth. So that's been a huge shift in espionage, and therefore
also a huge shift in society as well.
Yeah.
You know, the fundamental. I mean, as we discussed before, that when Edward Snowden went up in Moscow and him talking about all the CIA programs, and the one that always sticks in my mind is the one called Boundless Informant, which is something straight out of Jason Bourne. You know, as a writer, if you saw something called Boundless Informant, you would shut your laptop and go to the pub for the day. You go, it's perfect, and yet it exists. And without sounding too much like a conspiracy theorist, the panopticon is here
for sure. I have one in Box 88 called Intimate Kubrick. Which captures
he'd be happy with that.
He would be happy with that. It's you can't move now. If somebody wants to find out everything about me and basically the time it's taken you and I to have this interview, they can do it. People can be even to decide. I have a friend who refuses to have a mobile phone, but eventually he had to get one just to be in contact with his wife and picking up the kids, and then he's done.
Yes,
they know where you've been, who you're speaking to, what you're interested in. I mean, you're a big Facebooker. It would be your Facebook is fantastic. There's wonderful kind of content on there, but to do a psychological profile of you would take 3 hours based on your content. I mean, people are revealing.
I would like to think that the NSA have got better things to do.
Yes, exactly.
Maybe they haven't in lockdown.
Well, that's another mistaken belief, is that we're all being watched and we're all being listened to, and all of our conversations are being recorded. Of course they're not. You notice that it's only if you are of interest.
It's prioritized, but we can all be, and in the flick of a switch, if you are a person, you can go from being nobody to a person of interest.
Yeah,
and yes, but of course then it comes down to manpower as well. That every time there's a terrorist attack, people say, well, why weren't these people watched? And you go, well, they were watched, but you can't keep 3,000 people under 24/7 surveillance. You just can't, unless of course you co-opt an entire population, and then you become the Stasi, then you become North Korea, and you've lost an awful lot more than you've gained.
Which is what's happening to us. Priti Patel wants us to inform
our neighbours.
It's very weak.
No, but there's a very British dichotomy about enforcement. Because on the one hand, we like to think of ourselves as sort of great libertarians and so on, but on the other hand, we love to dob in anyone who's having a better time than we are. and for all the people who sit there and say we won't do this, there are an awful lot of curtain twitchers who will be on the hotline. The hotlines will be melting down.
Yeah.
With people saying, "Oh, there are 7 people in their house. They should be whatever."
Yeah, no, it's terrifying.
And well, the way around it apparently is obviously is to get all your friends to come as policemen. Then I think they're just raiding your house, and you haven't got the thing. Going back to the Box 88, a lot of Kite's early years are at a school called Alford, which is a thinly disguised Eton, where you went, and it's a kind of place that I think it clearly produces a certain kind of person and has psychological ramifications for good and for bad, especially in terms of espionage. Do you and clearly that comes through a lot in your writing.
Well, I the nard about just straight up calling it Eton in the series.
It was good enough for bombs.
Yeah, but somebody pointed out that there's certain things, like for example, Prince Dipendra of Nepal was at Eton when I was there, and then slayed his family a few years later. So you just sort of leave a door open to real life, to real history. So it made sense to call it Author. But yes,
he was also the only person who never had to go to chapel. Right? Yeah, but he was technically a god in his home country, and therefore could not worship another god.
That's probably why I went completely mad.
There could be a connection. I do remember that.
But I wanted to write about Eton, but because the culture here is dominated or has been recently dominated by three significant Latonians who've had a big effect on Rees-Mogg and Cameron and Boris Johnson.
What a bang-up job they've all done.
And what a wonderful job they've done. And
even a Harrovian would have done better.
And there's just a fair prejudice against Eton, and there's also a lot of nonsense spoken about it. But I thought that it would be quite interesting to take people back to the 1980s and to show them what it was like to be there and what the atmosphere was like, and how Kite is basically a kind of working class boy from the west coast of Scotland who, for complicated reasons, ends up there in 1985 and is thrust into this world of enormous privilege and wealth and influence, and actually flourishes there, does quite well. He's happier there than I was, so to speak. But it is a very, very strange place. Uniforms and language and just the fame, the infamy of the school, and to be there. I remember vividly sort of buses of Japanese tourists arriving at sort of, while you were walking between classes and sort of looking and taking photographs of you because you were in these strange sort of tailcoats. And you have your own room, so you're sort of isolated from the age of 13, not just from your fellow boys, but also from your mum and dad.
It's a brutal place, and I was there too. I was 2 years above you, and I don't mean brutal as in physically brutal. By the time you and I got there, corporal punishment had been abolished, fagging had been abolished. But it's a brutal place, and it's a very Darwinian place. Yeah. And there was something that actually I'd forgotten for a long time, which I think shows. I don't know if they still do it, but every term we'd have trials, exams, and they would call the whole year in, and they would read out the results from bottom upwards. Yeah. And there was always a couple who got what were called GTS, general total failures.
Yeah, but even that itself, a general total failure. I know that's announced in front of your
totally. That's boundless informant. That is that is not you have failed your exams. You are a general total failure.
As a young
person, you are basically breaking someone in front of 250 of their peers at the most psychologically vulnerable time of their life. And
I mean, sort of forgive them for they know not what they do.
Exactly.
I don't think it was,
It wasn't intentional. And you certainly look back then and you think, it was much better than it would have been in Tom Brown's school days or whatever, but it's still, it's the kind of place that you have to sink or swim. And I know a lot of people who thrived there and who were very successful. And I think it also produced a lot of people who had the confidence to do different things, for lack of a better word. I know a lot of actors who went there. I know quite a few people who are quite high in the voluntary sector who run charities and so on. It's not by any means all bankers, lawyers, and accountants.
Sure.
But
politicians.
Politicians. But also, I know a lot of people I know probably off the top of my head half a dozen who killed themselves. Yeah. It's not an easy place, and for a spy that has huge personal ramifications.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I think there's something about British boarding schools which have sort of been feeders for MI5 and MI6 for 100 years.
And particularly for the class episode.
Yeah, it's. I mean, one thing you probably could confidently say about most old Etonians is that they are sort of comfortable in a room. You can throw them into any environment, a kind of a party at the French embassy or a buffet in a kind of town hall in Yorkshire, and they'd be able to sort of function. And that's a key component of intelligence work, is being able to win friends and influence people, so to speak. Sort of the smoothness, the entitlement, which is a fair criticism that's often levelled at Etonian.
Well, totally. Someone said, you are taught for 5 years there that the sun exists purely to shine on you.
Yeah, it's dangerous. It is.
It's very dangerous.
Yeah. But and as you say, some people come out of it and have fabulous, interesting lives and contribute an enormous amount to society, and some people are smashed by it. Yeah, and I don't think it's just eating. I think the basic idea of separating a young boy or a young girl from their mum and dad at the age of 13 is, well, for me it was 8, and most of my friends it was 8. It's the same for you. Is really ill-advised. I don't think there's any other culture in the world that does that, and that does have an effect. But it also, we're talking about intelligence, we're talking about spying. It probably does make very good spies because you're used to this sense of sort of psychological isolation. You're used to putting on a mask to survive. You're used to being around.
Not just a mask, but a carapace.
Yeah.
You know, all around your, a shell.
We should lie down now.
This is turning to a therapy session.
Yeah. No, it is interesting. So I wanted to get into that and to give people a glimpse of what the school was like. And so there is that in Box 88. It's not not a huge amount of the story, but it definitely informs who Kite is.
No, but it comes through very clearly.
And I think he's an interesting. As I say, he's very different to me, and but he benefits from it more than most.
Yeah,
possibly because he's an outsider.
Yes, no, and that is true. That the outsider always brings a fresh pair of eyes into it, and sees the foibles and sees the good and the bad.
Yeah.
Well, this also brings me on to my next question, which is actually a question that was asked to me 20 years ago by a journalist for Dutch Playboy. Thus proving that you can actually read it for the articles, as your dad says. And he said to me, to what extent do you think crime novelists are society's moralists? And obviously to change that around a bit, I mean, I know that there's a great similarity between crime novelists and spy novelists. You're often marketed as a crime novelist, and the genre blur is actually fairly big. But I think it's almost a more interesting question for spy novelists. Crime novels tend to be, not all of them of course, but tend to be sealed in and of themselves. There's a three-part. There's an incident, there's an investigation, there's a resolution, and it's all neatly wrapped up in a way that it's not in real life. But espionage novels are often much more open-ended, and I think it says a lot about society, for good and bad, what spies do, what they're prepared to do, what the public is prepared to let them do. Mm-hmm. So to what extent do you feel that you are society's moralist?
I think I've shifted on this. I used to think that a political novel or a spy novel or a detective novel which made a political point or a societal, cultural point was a sort of useful thing and that it would change people's minds or at least sort of educate people. The more books I've written and the older I've got, the more I think that's just really not the case. And people have already made up their minds about 90% of the stuff that's in their lives. I think today's sort of moral compass, if you like, is Twitter. That all behaviour is sort of monitored in the sort of social media sphere, and that's where people are being told how to behave and how not to behave, and where they're being judged. But
they're also being told that by actually a very vocal but very small minority, and you see this every time there's an election comes around. Is that to listen to Twitter, Labour will always win by a landslide, but then of course the as G.K. Chesterton would have said, the quiet people cast their vote, and often it's a more general thing than I think just one social media platform.
I mean, to go back to your point about morality and espionage, and that you could sort of take the temperature of a country. I think this is Le Carré's point. You could sort of take the temperature of a country based on the behaviour of its intelligence services.
Yes, definitely.
So, you obviously you look to Moscow, you look to Putin, you look to what's happened to Navalny. He's just been poisoned a couple of weeks ago.
Going back to Skripal and
Litvinenko, and that tells you more or less everything you need to know about that sort of psychopathic gangster regime. Whereas here in Blighty, I like to think that we're not operating at that level. I think, of course, there are things that are done, military context, which might raise some eyebrows if they were brought to light. But broadly, I mean, I was briefly interviewed by MI6 25 years ago, and one of the first things they said was, officers are certainly not licensed to kill. I think it's a sort of image of spies going around.
Is that when you got up and walked out?
Yeah, exactly. I'm not interested. No, it's an intelligence gathering business, and hum it, to go back to what you were saying before. But are we sort of moralizers? Or do we have a sort of a responsibility? I'm not sure. I don't know. I think the more I've written and the more I've spoken to readers and sort of read reviews and so forth, the more I think people just want stories and great characters and
I'm not sure
and they want to know what. But that's the way that the culture's gone. It's just that's why the comparison you could make would be with the television version of Tinker Tailor, which is a masterpiece. But if you watch it, it's extraordinarily slow. There's I think about sort of 45 minutes of just Alec Guinness and that wonderful actress playing. There's Connie Sachs. I can't remember. Just sort of talking about the old times. No, you never get away with that in contemporary TV, anything on Netflix or Amazon Prime. It's just story. People are, you're sort of feeding a kind of a need for sugar. And so the political, moral dimension, I think, I may be wrong about this, is going from fiction.
But then again,
except in non-white male fiction.
Yeah.
That's where the political dimension is now.
True.
But it's gone from...
But then again, two things bring to mind. Firstly, when you talk about story, that goes in cycles. What's always struck me, looking at two of the greatest films ever, let alone in the 40s, Casablanca and The Third Man, is they both come in around about an hour 45, and they are both absolutely chock full of story, as well as character. So in those days, they really did rattle through stuff. And secondly, as a more general point about morality, that although you would hope that the British intelligence services are not as ruthless and as amoral as the FSB, there is still that sort of Orwell thing of rough men standing ready in the night, ready to visit violence on those who would do us harm. And and a nation cannot afford to be that picky about how people do it. Otherwise, a nation that does not maintain its own army will sooner or later be obliged to maintain someone else's.
But I would argue that work that you described, that Orwell described, is being done by the SBS, by SAS, by the Marines, by the military, whereas agent running is a ruthless.
But the military often working in
concert.
But
SAS will ring up and say, we've got a problem, we need you to help, and they'll take care of it sort of physically, so to speak.
Yes.
And SAS will do the cerebral stuff, the relationship building or the relationship smashing. That's sort of based broadly.
Yes.
True.
Although the special forces are justifiably proud of their remit as thinking soldiers. It's not simple. Hero orders, you follow them. It's
Oh, for sure. Well, those guys. I met a guy who was in SAS the other day. SAS. I think it was extraordinarily impressive, intellectually, and just the sort of the speed of his mind and his memory, and also you knew that he could snap your neck just over the prawn cocktail.
Exactly.
So
it's a sheet of A4, 28 ways to kill you.
Yeah. No, they're not just thugs.
No, not at all.
I'm not saying you were saying that.
No. I know, but even down to things like when you join the SAS or the SBS, enlisted men revert to the rank of trooper, and officers go one rank down, and ranks are almost irrelevant. Yeah. Here's a plan, take it apart. Yeah. And you don't just blindly follow orders. Talking of Box 88, how do you see that? And obviously, as you say, it's a sort of combined US-UK outfit. How do you see the special relationship in terms of espionage and more generally in terms of politics?
Well, the road answer is that we care about it, and the Americans don't think about the special relationship.
This is very Hugh Grant and Billy Bob Thornton in Love Actually.
Exactly, yeah. That was a sort of wishful film.
Yes.
The Prime Minister was actually have the spine to stand up to Trump or Clinton or whoever it might be.
Or Billy Bob.
But in terms of a relationship sharing, we're hugely reliant on the Americans for SIGINT and all the rest of it. And as they are relying on us for the more sort of human dimension of intelligence work. But God knows what it's been like with Trump and the State Department the last 4 years. It's sort of shudder to think, and then it'll be very interesting to see what happens in 90 days, less than that now, 40 days time.
If it happens.
Yeah. Which way it goes. But in terms of spy fiction, the American trend has always been much more sort of militaristic and much more gung ho and much more blow things up and we've only got 7 seconds. Everybody get out of here. Whereas so George Smiley is come on George. They want stuff to be happening. More kind of Ian Fleming, if you like, more James Bond, more London. Whereas our tradition here is Ambler and Le Carré and Dayton, just more sort of contemplative and a spoon moving every 15 pages, but it's gripping.
I remember the film version of Tinker Tailor that if they'd taken all the shots of Gary Oldman looking out the window, they'd removed them and it'd been about 15 minutes long.
We got to finish. I'll tell you a story. I was on the set of Ticket Tailor. On a magical day, I managed to go with somebody because I knew one of the producers, and I was there with Colin Firth, John Hurt, Gary Oldman, all the guys there in the secure speaker room, the kind of orange room, and Gary Oldman came out. He was always hanging around with John Hurt, so they were sort of going off drinking or something. And he came up and he had a picture of Toby Jones, who played Toby Esterhazy. He said, "Look at Toby. I've just gone up to him. I said, you've got to play Truman Capote. You look exactly like Truman Capote." John Hurt went, "He has played Truman Capote." He had no idea. He really just insulted him, not knowing about his work. Anyway, it was.
I'll give you another Gary Oldman thing. That Gary Oldman is 10 days younger than Gary Newman.
On that bombshell.
That bombshell. There you go. Brilliant. Thank you.